So welcome to Łódź, Poland. I'm here at my in-laws' place just outside of Łódź, and I wanted to do a little reflection and a little commentary on these nice collections of German items coming from the Łódź area starting in the 1910s and 20s throughout the war period. This is interesting because these items were collected by two separate families here in Łódź that were united in marriage. And as they began to inherit things from the grandparents, we end up with this collection here of various things that were gathered originally by the grandparents from one side and the grandparents from the other side, and now they're all together in one household. And I thought it would be great to do a little commentary on material culture. Material culture is basically the study of objects as ways of telling a story about the people who produced them, right? Products of a culture, products of an ethnic group. And it helps us to do a little commentary on Łódź itself as a multi-ethnic city in the old Polish Empire and later in the Poland that became independent after 1918. And you know, Germans were about 10% of the population of Łódź, you know, up to 1939 when Hitler invaded Poland. There was also around 35% of Jewish people. A lot of them, in fact, probably most of them, if not all, they were actually Polish citizens. Many of them had been war veterans of the First War. But the ethnic German population was significant. There had been in Germany a concept of the Ausland Deutsche, the Germans who are Germans in culture and language, but they live abroad. They don't live within the boundaries of the German Reich. And for many, many decades, since the 19th century, that had been kind of a neutral concept. It became, as we will see in a minute, weaponized in 1938. But what I've done here is I've basically grouped the objects in four different categories. First, objects that relate to leisure, here on my right. Objects that relate to the world of business in Łódź, represented by the scale. Then various types of household items, like these two things here, China objects. And then a few things that we could say they're luxury items, but they're also typically German with the high level of German manufacture. All of these items were basically treasured and cherished by the Polish families who gathered them or inherited them, or they were given them in a period ranging from the 1910s and 20s to throughout the war period, and then they were kept since that time to now. So basically, starting with the leisure items, we have here basically a bunch of the typical German steins, and you can zoom in now on these, but very nicely crafted, very detailed steins with nice inscriptions made by different German manufacturers. And I am told that, as was typical in other parts of the German-speaking world, people like to have their own personal stein at the bar, so that when they went there, they would be served in their own mug. These glasses are interesting, right? Number one, because they have the inscription. This one basically says greetings from and the name. And then this one basically, it's a beer glass, and it is inscribed to Ferdinand Sol with a date of 26th of August 1904, which I believe that would have been his birth date. But the thing that I like about it is that Sol actually happens to be, if I'm not mistaken, a Jewish name, you know. And this was the time when Jews and Germans and Poles and some ethnic Russians were coexisting together within the city of Łódź. Not without tensions, but let's say they were coexisting. And this gentleman here would have been part of the beer drinking culture of Germans as a German speaker, regardless of his religion. Now, this object here in the middle is also very interesting. It's a scale, and I can imagine this scale having been used in a German-owned shop, probably somewhere on Piotrkowska, the commercial street, where, you know, he would have weighed the products. You know, you sell them. And then this was kept in the home of the grandparents of my wife, perhaps as a way of cross-checking. You know, did they really sell us a kilo of tomatoes, or did they really sell us a kilo of kartofle, the potatoes, and so forth. And it's still in fairly good working condition since that time. Now, these things here, these pieces of china are, let's say, in the category of typical household items. This one, it says zur Erinnerung. That means in remembrance of, typical German dedication to something. We don't know what it's in remembrance of, but there it is. It's a nicely crafted piece of china. This one, this little box is also interesting to me. There you can see the manufacturer's inscription and the date of 1939. And it's interesting because, of course, that's the year in which the Germans invaded Poland. Now, before I move into the luxury item category, I wanted to mention that there was a kind of a breaking point or dividing line in terms of German ethnicity in Poland. And I guess we could place that in 1938, because that's when Hitler coined the term Volksdeutscher in a memorandum that he sent to a bunch of party leaders or regional leaders. And that's when he basically coined the term. I mean, before that, German government authorities would have referred to the Germans living abroad as Ausland Deutsche, those who live abroad. But the Volksdeutsche term is basically, it became a part of the Nazi ideology of a special people, right? A master race, and Volk is inherently related to blood and race. And so, as we know, one of the justifications for the invasion of Poland in August and September 1939 was this notion that they were Volksdeutsche. They were people who were ethnic Germans, blood Germans in Poland and other parts. They were persecuted, so Hitler argued, and therefore he had to invade to go and protect it. And just as an aside, that is exactly the same argument that Putin is using today in relation to Ukraine. Another point of coincidence between the mindset of Hitler and that of Putin today is that Putin basically believes that Ukraine has now no right to exist as an independent nation. It's not a legitimate nation. And that's, of course, exactly what Hitler and later the Gauleiter of the general government, Hans Frank, said about Poland. It's not a real culture. It's not a real state. But anyway, in 1939, of course, that weaponized notion of the Volksdeutsche came into effect as the Germans invaded. And that's why I wanted to have a separate collection of items, which are kind of a luxury goods. They're kind of silver covered boxes, and this nice little object here with some silver engraved in it. But what happened with the Germans, with the German population, the ethnic Germans in Poland in 1939, of course, is that they were endowed with some special rights. They were recognized as ethnic Germans, and of course there was a list, the Volkslist, in which that 10% of people who had German last names, and they could trace their ancestry, and they could, of course, try to demonstrate there was no Jewish blood and so forth. They had basically better food. They had better homes. In fact, many of them were given the homes of Poles, right? Poles had been expelled from a lot of their farms and their homes, especially in the region of which Łódź was a part. Łódź was renamed Litzmannstadt, German city, German general from the First World War, Litzmann, and was also part of the new German province, the Warthegau, right? And the Gauleiter wanted to make this a blonde province, and not only Judenfrei, free of Jews, but also free of Slavs. And so they began to bring in this ethnic Germans, this Volksdeutsche from the Baltics, from Romania, from other places. And so better farms, better homes, better food. They were basically first-class citizens. Shocking to the local population because these had been their neighbors. But suddenly, if you wanted to get on the tram to go somewhere in downtown Łódź, you couldn't take the first car because that was reserved for the Volksdeutsche together with the Wehrmacht personnel and so forth. But anyway, turning to these objects, this first one is really interesting to me. It's the typical jewelry box where a woman would put her necklaces or whatever, or perhaps a man would put his cufflinks or his rings. But the interesting thing is that it's the same as this one, but this one has an inscription on it. It has an anagram, MB, and also these numbers. And when I looked at that, as someone who is somewhat well read in Wehrmacht and German units during the Second World War. That is the standard way, the standard notation for referring to number 5 is the company, / number 1 in Roman numerals is the battalion, and then 29 is the regiment. So this would have been 5th Company, 1st Battalion, 29th Infantry Regiment. The reason why that's interesting is that Genya, who is my wife's grandmother, who is the person who had collected this item, told us a little story some time ago about one time when she was arrested by the Gestapo for either trading or buying or possessing, I think it was sugar, one of the items that were controlled by the German occupiers in the context of, let's say, war economy here. And the reason, the justification, let's say, that she had for possessing the sugar or whatever the item was that she was in the process of cooking a meal for a person, a soldier, perhaps an officer, who had just come back from Stalingrad. He was a survivor of the Battle of Stalingrad, or basically he came home before early 1943 as someone who had been wounded in battle and therefore was spared the complete destruction, right, of the army group there. But the point is that we've looked up Infantry Regiment 29, and that was in fact one of the regiments that was engaged in the fighting in and around Stalingrad. So it's a fascinating thing to think that perhaps this is the story behind this. In any case, I'm fairly confident about this inscription. Now, another little object here that is kind of interesting is this. And you can see there that essentially it's a little mirror, but it's beautifully decorated on the back with what looks like to be some mother pearl. And it has this inscription of Litzmannstadt. That's the German name of Łódź. Łódź as part of the German province of Warthegau, honoring a German Prussian officer, general, and the year of 1942. And the fascinating thing, of course, there is that 1942 was the year in which, for example, the Jewish children in the ghetto in Łódź were exterminated, and they were sent to their deaths in the gas vans of Chełmno. And it's a classic example of how different objects can have different meanings for different people. And it's one of the things that we can use material culture to decipher and unpack. So for a German, this would have been a wonderful object celebrating, let's say, the height of prestige and honor. We are Germans in a German city. We have special rights. We are honored. We are respected. We have the best of the best. The future couldn't be brighter. The meaning of that changed, of course, with time as 1943 came around, 1944, and then January 1945, when the Soviet army was knocking on the door here and actually conquered the city around the middle of the month of January. For a Pole, this would have been basically a reminder of their shame. It says that our city has not only been taken over by these Germans who were our neighbors, but now they have become the master race. We have become second-class citizens. And this thing, Litzmannstadt, I mean, that's my hometown, right? This has become something foreign to me, in which I am at best a second or third-class citizen. I can't even ride the tram the way I used to anymore. And if you're a Jewish person, a Jewish citizen of Łódź, needless to say, this is a reminder of your destruction as a race and the hatred of the Nazi ideology that wants to bring an end to your people and to your history. Thankfully and successfully in the end, but with dramatic loss of life in this part of the world. So anyway, I think that it's a fascinating collection. I'm grateful that these objects were preserved through time, and I think they become valuable to the extent that we're able to tell a story. It's a little introduction to material culture and how objects that are the product of a culture like the German minority here can help us tell a story. Thank you very much.